Hello, this is the second in the series of introductory lectures, seminars, to Pagan Theology. And for this particular lecture we're going to look at the issue of deities and spirits and how we understand those concepts in different branches of pagan religion. And try to stimulate some ideas and hopefully give you things to talk about with your fellow pagans, either in person or online or whatever route you prefer to discuss by. There are different understandings of what constitutes divinity, the divine, the gods, or deities, whatever word you want to use, within different traditions, both modern day pagan traditions, by which I mean traditions that have started within the last 150 years, but also those ancient traditions that are documented from thousands of years ago, and indeed intermediary traditions that have survived to a much later period of time, such as the forms of paganism found in Lithuania, which survived much later than the forms of paganism found in other parts of the world. Now, in talking about the various different styles of view of understanding of what divinity is, my intention for this seminar is just to give you descriptions, views, where possible, drawing on the words, the ideas of people who subscribe to those particular views, so insider points of view, as it were, and not to promote any of them as being the right version or the correct version, because that is, you might well argue, I certainly would, one of the defining features of pagan traditions is that they are quite pluralist by nature, which is to say, whereas in some religions there is a sense of exclusive truth, that a religion will say there is only one truth and we have it and it's this, and present it to the world. Within the pagan traditions, much like the Vedic traditions of India, there is a notion that, well, to use the analogy often presented in Vedic writings, that truth is like a vast mountain with many, many paths going up to the top of the mountain. And each religion is a route to the top. Some might get you there quicker than others, but eventually they will all get you there. Concurrent with that is the notion that all religions have some truth in them, and also, of course, by definition, they'll also have some mistakes and misunderstandings in them. The pagan one's no different from any others, and that is quite reflective of the Western pagan view, as well as I say, the Vedic view from the Indian religions, that there are many different understandings of the divine. In the first seminar I gave the Jain analogy of the 5 blind men and the elephant, where they're all touching a different bit of the elephant and think it's something different. In that same sense, these views of the divine, you could say, are all attempts to touch this vast, incomprehensible force and describe it in ways that make the most sense to the people doing the touching. So one person thinks it's one thing, another person thinks it's another thing, and there's no exclusivity of truth, in the sense that you won't get pagans going to war with each other, persecuting each other, setting light to one another, because this person's view of divinity is different from that person's view of divinity, and they're at one another's throats in warfare over it. There's a sense that, well, this makes sense to me, I don't quite get what you're on about, but fair enough. If that's what you believe, that's what you believe, you get on with it. And you will get, in a ritual context, polytheists, monotheists, atheists, standing side by side, participating in the same rituals. Not all of the time, there's not some kind of Noah's Ark thing where you've got to tick off one of everything before you can begin the ritual. But it is perfectly possible to attend, especially a public ritual, one of the larger scale gatherings, where you will find lots of different views of divinity, and often different styles of pagan, different traditions of pagan, heathens, druids, Wiccans, Cometics, etc., participating in the same ritual gathering, in a kind of a celebratory fashion. So again, not the sense of one tradition being the absolutely only true and everything else being false, but each tradition being a description of an experience of some aspect of divinity. So that's the goal for today. Now, just as we started the first of these seminars with some technical terms, theological jargon, so we have a new batch of theological jargon terms to introduce here. So just very briefly flow through these, and then we'll get into them in slightly more depth as we go along. So atheism is the idea that there is no, well, either there is no deity, or at least there is no reliable evidence of deity, and therefore there is no point in believing in something for which there is no reliable evidence. There are some traditions from around the world in which there are claims that yes, deity does exist. However, that deity has created the world, created humanity, and then gone off somewhere, having a fag, playing bingo, doing whatever deity is doing, and takes no more active part in human existence. Therefore, there's no point praying to the deity or troubling the deity because you won't get a response. And that is, in a sense, a form of atheism, in as much as people who subscribe to those philosophies are living their lives, conducting themselves without direct reference to the divine. They're not talking to deity, they're not seeking its help, they're not engaging with it because they believe that deity is no longer interested. So to all intents and purposes, they are theistic in the original Greek sense, to be atheos, without God, without the divine. So there are variations on that, but generally speaking, in the West, probably the majority of people who describe themselves as atheists would simply say they don't believe that there are any gods in the universe at all. Agnostics are people who feel that the jury is out when it comes to evidence, that it's not conclusive, but they're not absolutely sure there either is a deity, or equally they're not absolutely sure there is not a deity, so they're kind of uncertain, shall we say. And in practical terms, mostly living their lives in a similar way to atheists live, even though they're not as perhaps convinced by the non-existence of deity as most atheists are, because they're unconvinced, they're not likely to do, not likely to attend religious services or participate very much, because they're unconvinced. Monotheists believe there is a singular deity, and that deity may be conceived of as male, or as female, or as of some kind of neutral gender, or a different form of gender. But the key point is that there is only one of them. Islam, Christianity, Judaism are good examples of that, although Judaism in its early forms, it's debatable whether it was quite monotheistic to start with, or maybe whether it was henotheistic, but that's a separate issue, or not really relevant here. You do encounter monotheist pagans, just as you encounter atheist pagans, and we'll get to those as we go along. Animism is quite probably, as far as most historians seem to think at any rate, the earliest form of religious expression in humanity. Animism is the belief that everything has animus, or spirit, or anima, if you want to put it in the feminine sense. Animus is the masculine Latin, anima is the feminine Latin. A spirit, or a soul, various ways you can translate that term. Not only is there this sort of animating energy, but implicit in the idea of the animus or anima is the sense that it has awareness. It has some kind of thought process, for lack of a better term. Although that's not quite the best way of describing it, but there is an awareness to that spirit. It knows what's going on. So any entity that has an anima or animus is aware at some level, not necessarily at the same level as each other. So this isn't an argument that mushrooms and humans and parrots all have the same level of awareness, but rather that they have a level of awareness suitable to their own existence. Some forms of animism focus on organic beings, humans, cats, dogs, horses, trees, plants, etc. Others expand the notion of what has animus to a much wider extent, and will argue that rocks and rivers and clouds, the planet itself, practically everything which exists has animus or anima. And some will go further to say not only do naturally existing phenomena have spirit, but so do created phenomena, so a jumper, or a sword, or a drum, something that is made by human hand, will also have animus. but we'll get to that as we go along. Polytheism, which is where I personally sit in this list of labels, is very similar in many respects to animism. In fact, I'd argue that they are just slightly different versions of the same thing. The key difference is that some of these spirits, which the polytheist acknowledges as existing, are vast spirits. So whereas animism often it's small spirits of individual plants, individual animals, individual rocks, individual rivers, and it's on the somewhat more small day-to-day scale. Polytheism has that, but also has a layer on top of these vast cosmic entities, gods, goddesses, deities, who are part and parcel of the animist perspective, but are the animating presences of much, much bigger concepts, rather than a rock, a river, a tree. It's every forest on the planet, or every ocean on the planet, or the planet itself, or abstract notions that are of importance to human beings, like deities associated with justice, or with art, or with love. More abstract concepts. Pantheism takes the idea that deity is everywhere. Some monotheists would also, by definition, never be pantheists, in that there are some monotheist traditions that believe deity is absolutely everywhere, whereas other monotheist traditions believe that deity created the universe and then sits outside it, sits over here, kind of looking at the universe from the outside, much as an artist might make a sculpture. But the artist is not the sculpture, the artist is separate from the sculpture, whereas the pantheist sees divine within every cell in existence. So every living being is part and parcel of that eternal presence, that permeating force. And speaking of force, George Lucas, when he was writing Star Wars and May the Force be with you, that's very much a pantheist idea. So he's kind of given a science fiction spin to an old pantheist concept that it's not a personalised source like an individual god or an individual goddess with a name and likes and dislikes and so forth. Rather, it's a presence that permeates the whole cosmos, everything that exists as part and parcel. Pantheism, the deity that is everywhere, is all things. Theism and deism are concepts of how personal or impersonal deity is, but we'll kind of explore those as we go along. But to look at specific forms of paganism, already said that animism is probably the most ancient religious phenomena in the world, the root of pretty much all of today's religions of whatever sort can ultimately trace their roots back hundreds and thousands of years to early animistic beliefs. And some surviving religions are still very overtly animistic. The pagan ones, for example, most of them, maybe not every form of paganism, because there's a lot of different types of religion in the world today that class as pagan, but a lot of them will certainly fit within the animist traditions of engaging with spirits. So to give examples practical, I have an altar to the spirits of my house, because I'm quite convinced that there are spirits living in my house, and I make them offerings and try to keep on good terms with them, as do many, many other pagans do the same thing. Are they gods? Well, no, not to me. They are small-scale spirits who are resident in the bricks, the mortar, the timber, the very structure of this house, and in some cases were here before the house was built. So they occupied the land and what was on this land. My house was built in 1888. There were rivers and fields and what have you. Well, a river used to flow almost straight through where my house now is, before it was dammed up and diverted back in Victorian times. So there is a presence here connected to the river that used to flow here. So even though the water doesn't flow anymore, there is a spirit that remembers when it did. And so there is that kind of communication with the spirits of the land. I mentioned that some animists extend the definition of what has animus from organic life forms to non-organic life forms like rivers. Well, Most people obviously would not class a river as a life form, but to the animist, it is. And some would go further. There's not only naturally occurring phenomena like rivers and mountains and beaches and so on, but would also include artificial created items. So when a painter produces a portrait, you have the combination of the canvas and the paints and so on, all of which have ultimately come from organic sources if you trace them back far enough. Even if a lot of paint these days is manufactured in laboratories, nonetheless, originally the substances came from natural phenomena. But there's the blood, the sweat, the tears of the artist going into that creative act, and as the artist makes the portrait, creates it, invests themselves in it, a spark from the artist enters into that canvas and it takes on a presence. It might well be argued that the subject matter, whatever it is that it's a painting of, whether it's a bowl of fruit or a human being or a landscape scene or whatever it might be, that something of the thing that is being painted also perhaps enters into the portrait itself, or I say portrait, image itself. And it's a very personal thing, and therefore for many animists, wouldn't suggest all of them perhaps, because there are varying shades of opinion, but for many animists there is a sense that that created article, the painting hanging in a gallery somewhere, is a living entity in that it is animated, it has soul, it has presence. Those ideas go back to ancient times when most things were handmade, before mass production was the phenomenon that it is today. So if there was a wooden chair, that wooden chair, every part of it would have been shaped by hand by a carpenter, who would have been pouring his or her blood, sweat and tears, probably literally blood if they're as clumsy as I am with chisels, into that finished product. Nowadays we live in an era of mass production, of things churned out of factories where hardly a human being is involved, and like a lot of cars, for example, are made by robots and churned out by robots and maybe given a polish at the end by a human being, but that's about it. Do mass-produced articles have soul in the same way that a handcrafted article has soul? That's something I've often wondered about, and those of you who've sat through talks that I've given will probably have heard that discussion going on at some point if you've been to enough of my talks. I don't actually know. I suspect not, personally. I suspect that mass-produced tack sold in Poundland or wherever has no soul in and of itself. Maybe once it's acquired it becomes an object of usage, and the constant interaction with human beings might eventually invest it with some kind of presence. But I think we are now in an era where there's a lot of soulless dead articles around, where once upon a time practically every bowl, every basket, every sword, every axe would have been made from raw materials and crafted, and the energies of the craftsman or craftswoman poured into it. They would have been alive in a way that relatively few objects are alive these days, especially in the Western world where mass production is as vastly flooded. Maybe it has to, I haven't travelled in the East to have a clear sense of how widespread mass production is over there, probably as much as it is over here in the West. How all of this impacts, and in a sense you could say, well, why does any of this matter? Isn't it all just airy-fairy ideas? If you believe objects are alive, it creates a relationship between you and them, because you come to see that object as aware, as thinking, as something you talk with, negotiate with, rather than as just dead soulless objects to be used and thrown away. So let's say, I think a few examples, let's say you need to do a bit of gardening and you need to trim a few branches off the tree in your garden. If you regard that as just a lump of mindless wood, then you'd go out and you'd saw off the branches and not give a second thought to it. if you regard that tree as an animated entity with thought and a capacity for sensation, then, as many pagans do, you might well talk to that tree, saying, I need to saw off a few of your branches, brace yourself, as it were, and so you give that tree a chance to prepare itself for what might otherwise be a very invasive experience of being, having bits of it being sawn off. Likewise, if you think of a lot of ancient hunting cultures, before they'd go out on the hunt, they would pray to the spirit of the zebra or the antelopes or whatever it was that they were going to hunt, and ask for sort of kind of a forgiveness in advance, I suppose, that we need to eat one of your number. Please allow us to do so, and then having killed the poor beast and cooked it, there would be a thanksgiving for the soul of the creature that was being consumed, and the hope that its soul would enter into the afterlife and not bear a grudge, not seek revenge on the humans that had hunted it, but also perhaps that it would reincarnate and come back into the world and have a better life next time than this time. But then again, if you just view the cow or the sheep or the goat as some clueless entity with very little awareness, you might kill it without a second thought and at no juncture have any kind of gratitude or thanks for the life of the creature or what happens to it after death, because you just now view it as a dead lump of meat rather than a previously alive lump of meat. So there is an impact in terms of having these beliefs and where they lead you to, what they lead you to do, how they lead you to behave accordingly. Polytheistic paganism builds upon the bedrock of animistic paganism, so you still have that plethora of spirits of trees, of rocks, of rivers, of cats and dogs and horses and gerbils and haddock and what have you. But you also have a pantheon atop of very, very large spirits. Spirits that have influence over vast areas. Now the spirit of again, I'll try and give you a practical example of how this might impact. There's a river, a 10-minute walk from where I live, which is the main river that flows through this town. That river has a spirit, it has an animating presence. If I were to get in a car and I can't drive, so somebody would have to drive for me, drive 1,000 miles away, that's a bit melodramatic in Britain, 1,000 miles. Let's say I were to drive 300 miles away and get out the car there. Would there be any point in my conducting a ritual or ceremony to communicate with the spirit of the river that's 10-minute walk from my house if I am then 300 miles away? An animist might well suggest, well, no, because the spirit of the river is present in the river. If you're not by the river, you're a long, long way away. Is there any point talking to it? For a polytheist, there might well be a goddess or a god connected to all rivers. So not just that one local river, but every single river. And so 300 miles away, I could potentially communicate with the deity of water, the deity of rivers, even though I'm not near that particular river. And so if you want to try and visualise when polytheists are talking about kind of local spirits and gods and different tiers of entity, what they mean by all of this, a local spirit is the spirit of a very particular place, the guardian spirit, the genius loci, as the Romans would have called it, of a river. And if you're far from that river, there's very little point trying to communicate with it, any more than shouting at a relative who lives 300 miles away and expecting them to be able to hear you. Just by shouting at them, it wouldn't work, clearly. Whereas deities have guardianship, rulership over a much wider area, are geographically unbounded, they can be encountered anywhere. There's a book by Neil Gaiman, American Gods, which has also been made into a TV series, in which the gods of the old world of Europe and Africa and so on travel to America, manifested in human guise. They take on kind of flesh avatars, and they go off and they live in America. As different groups of people, so as Polish people migrate to America, the Polish gods go with them, and as Greek people migrate to America, the Greek gods go with them. So there's a kind of an adventure based around the interaction of all these different gods and goddesses and how they relate to humanity in the new world of America. That is a sense within polytheism that gods are unbound. So although we might describe a deity as a Greek deity or a Roman deity or an Australian Aboriginal deity, that doesn't mean that they are only encountered in those geographic land masses. You could still encounter a Greek deity if you live in Clacton or Vladivostok or Canberra. They're not limited by human notions of political geography. They go where they damn well please. And so that is perhaps a distinguishing difference between deity, in the big sense, and local spirit, which is very much of the locality and doesn't tend to be encountered anywhere other than in its locality. Polytheism embraces the idea of many deities. Most people in the ancient world grew up knowing the deities of their own people. Those who became sailors, merchants, travelled the world, encountered other civilizations, would have learnt about the gods of other civilizations, and sometimes incorporated them. So it was not uncommon to find, for example, the Roman Empire, which incorporated a huge swathe of the world at that time, that there would be people whose altars in their homes that have a little altar in their house as well as the big temples, a little altar in the house. They might have small statues of Roman gods on it, but there might also be there an Egyptian one, or a British one, or a Germanic one, because they had encountered, either they'd moved to those areas or they'd encountered someone from those areas and been very impressed by them and what they'd said about their gods, and so touched by that perhaps they say you've got a merchant who wants to trade with the Germanic tribes, they might well have had a statue of one or other of the Germanic deities on their altar and prayed to them for help in retailing their goods for a decent price to people of that land. So what you didn't get is that notion that if you're a Catholic you can't engage in Islamic ritual, if you're a Muslim you can't engage in Jewish ritual, you're one thing or another, you can't be a multitude of things. In the ancient world, although there was the sense, well, that's how the Greeks do it, and that's how the Romans do it, and that's how the Egyptians do it, except it was much more subdivided down than that. But a sense of cultural practice, it wasn't exclusivist cultural practice. There wasn't a sort of racial snobbery saying, well, you can't worship our gods because you're not of our people. It was much more open than that, much more fluid and interacting. And so you would get people who would pick up not only on the primary set of deities that they'd grown up with, but sometimes they'd also add other deities from other cultures to their awareness and not see them as exclusive. The Romans had the idea of syncretism, that they would move into a new culture, usually by military conquest, and they'd look at the gods and goddesses of that culture and think, oh, this one is quite similar to Minerva, and that one is quite similar to Jupiter. And so they would fuse the two deities together and build a temple in the Roman style and say to the local people, well, here's a Roman temple. By all means go and worship your local gods, continue doing what you're doing, but here's a Roman temple to do it in, and your gods are quite similar to our gods, and we want you to start using a kind of a joint name, a fused name. Blending elements of one cult, your own native culture, with elements of your new dominant culture. Your new political masters are overlaying their culture on top of your native culture and shaping a syncretized fusion between the two. Which, of course, is nothing confined to the ancient world. You can find syncretized cultures going on all over the place. Candomblé, Santeria, a whole raft of traditions that blend elements of Catholicism with African beliefs, with beliefs from the Central and South Americas and other regions, where one culture overlays on top of another culture and there's an interaction going on between them. Which then leads to quite challenging theological questions. to which there are no clear-cut answers. So let's say you've got Apollo, who for the Greeks was very much associated with music, with the sun, with healing and health and so on. Lots of other things too, but we'll keep it simple. And then amongst the ancient Gaulish people, or what these days is called France, you had Granos, who was associated with hot springs bubbling up from the earth and the healing powers of hot springs. So you've got two deities associated with healing and also warmth. One is the warmth of the sun and the other is the warmth of the hot springs bubbling up from the earth. Are they the same being? Just in one occasion it's the Greek name given to that deity, and the other occasion it's the Gaulish name given to that deity. Or are these two very different beings who just happen to have a certain kind of overlap in common with each other? For some modern day pagans, as for some ancient pagans, they will be treated as two very, very different, separate, unique beings, deities. Whereas others, again, modern and ancient alike, might say, well, these are basically different names for the same force, for the same presence. And so it doesn't matter if you refer to that presence as Apollo or you refer to that presence as Granos. It's basically the same being. So you get variations of theological understanding within polytheism as to quite what it is that's being interacted with. And which one is right, which one is wrong, who knows at the end of the day. It's our best understanding, again, blind men and the elephant, our best understanding of what we experience those beings as like, and how that then influences our ritual practices and so forth. How we conduct our lives based upon our best understanding of what's out there. So for some pagans there might be a set number of deities. Polytheism, many gods. So many essentially is two or more. So for some people there could be a set number, perhaps there's 12 deities or 33 deities or whatever, and looking around the globe, all of the different cultures and traditions of the world will worship that same set, will just have their own local names for them. Other polytheists might say, nope, there's 100 deities, 1,000 deities, 1,000,000 deities. There is an unspecified number of deities, and all of these different names and different cultures are indeed different beings. They're not the same entity. Therefore, Zeus is not Jupiter, even though they are similar in many respects, they're not the same being. They're two different beings. And pagans of both those outlooks can participate alongside each other in ceremony and ritual in groups and so forth. Those ideologies are not mutually exclusive to one another. They're just people's best understanding of what is out there, made on the limited capacity of humans to grasp this vast cosmic presence. What's out there? There are monotheistic pagans. There were some in the ancient world, probably more of them in the 21st century than there were in the ancient world, I'd guess. Well, partly because there's more humans in the 21st century than there were in the ancient world, but I suspect the percentage, personally, I suspect it's increased anyway. So a monotheist pagan is one who believes all of the different gods and goddesses and so forth are essentially different words, different names for the same central force. It's sometimes distinguished from the type of monotheism you find in Islam and Christianity and so forth by referring to it as inclusive monotheism, to make it slightly different from exclusive monotheism. Exclusive monotheism says there is one deity, we have the name for it, and if you call it by a different name, you are mistaken, you're deluded, you're wrong. This is the only acceptable way in which to understand deity. Now, some monotheist pagans believe all deities ultimately resolve to a feminine force, hence the picture on the screen. So they're all expressions of a cosmic goddess. Others are more duotheistic in that they will argue that there is a male force and a female force, so all of the goddesses are different names for the same feminine force, and all of the gods are different names for the same masculine force. These days, with the changing views and understandings of gender that came about, or became popularised in the late 20th into 21st century. You also get people who will argue for a kind of a third gender neutral force that is neither male nor female but other. And so there is a sort of, for some people, a three-way version rather than a two-way version as to what all of these spirits resolve back into being. And if you take that approach, again thinking of the practicalities, if you feel that all goddesses are the same goddess, it doesn't really matter what name you use. Whether you call that goddess Hecate or Danu or Juno or Sarasvati or whatever else, they're all different names for the same entity. And so you could have a ritual with 5 people participating in the ritual and each person uses a different name, but they're all referring to this central cosmic goddess into which all else resolves. And that wouldn't be an issue. Whereas for a polytheist, using 5 different names might well suggest 5 different beings, and that could lead to some degree of confusion. In that most rituals you want a kind of a harmony of focus, that this ritual is going to be about the deities of winter. We're going to communicate with the deities of winter, therefore calling upon a deity of summer or a deity of spring would just confuse the picture. So for the purposes of an individual ritual, there may be a focus that wants a certain set of deities or interrelated deities to be called on rather than others that are not directly relevant to the theme of the ritual. So subtle differences in how ritual might be carried out according to whether we're looking at monotheistic or polytheistic views of deity. We also have the phenomena of secular paganism, or atheist paganism, the notion that the various gods, goddesses, what have you, are not real, but are metaphors for understanding life, the universe, natural phenomena, or the human psyche, normally a combination of all of those. As an idea, you can find people in the ancient world who were what we would nowadays call atheist or secular pagans. They didn't use those terms themselves back then, but there were people saying that the gods, the goddesses are metaphors, they're not actually real beings. So this isn't a brand new idea, although it has become more popular in modern times than it probably was in ancient times. The chap in the black and white image is Louis Menard, a French writer, who revived the interest in the idea of mythology and paganism as a way of understanding the world, but in a secular sense. So feeling that was offering something better to the world than monotheism was, by which, obviously, being French, he was chiefly thinking of Catholicism, but other forms of monotheism by extension. A chap in the colour photograph is James Hillman, who was a psychologist, very much influenced by Carl Jung and the ideas of Carl Jung, went on to found his own variation of the ideas of Carl Jung, which he called archetypal psychology, and wrote books like The Soul Code, which not the easiest read going. His literary style is a bit like wading through treacle, but lots of fascinating ideas. And again, much as both Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud did earlier on, both of whom were fascinated by mythology, but saw mythology, whether Greek, Roman, Norse, Jewish, Celtic, whatever else, the stories and mythologies of the ancient world as partly ways of accounting for natural phenomena, like the changes of the season and so on, but also ways of describing the depths of the human psyche, in which the gods and the goddesses and the monsters and the kings and the queens and the heroes and so on were representative of human experience. And so within secular paganism there is a love of mythology. It can be trying to tweeze out the difference between a pagan atheist and an atheist can sometimes feel like nailing jelly to a wall. But someone who is an atheist, as it were, need not have the slightest interest in mythology at the end. It may be a complete irrelevancy to their life. Whereas a pagan atheist, or secular pagan, whatever phrase you want to use, is someone who has a great love of story and mythology, not as a principle of theological reality, but as a guideline to human life, as a source of wisdom and understanding about human nature, a kind of a touchstone, I suppose you could say. I've never participated in a secular pagan ritual, so I have no direct experience to draw on as to what that would be like. But there are secular pagans who, as well as reading books on mythology and discussing the meanings of mythology in a kind of psychological way like James Hillman did, also believe in ritual as important, particularly for things like the turning of the seasons and births, deaths, marriages and the big events in human life, that humans are ritualistic creatures. We like to mark changes with gatherings, and there's a sort of social role to ritual. It bonds people together, it gives shared value, shared meaning to life, shared importance, and that therefore it is important to have ritual, but the ritual is not done in the same way as a more religious form of ritual would, but by people who believe the gods are real. It's done in a more kind of, almost like psychodrama, I suppose you could say, which is a tradition often found within humanistic psychology and transpersonal psychology, as a form of sometimes as a form of therapy for damaged people, but even for healthy people as a way of sustaining their good psychological health. So both to repair the damage caused to people who've been emotionally, psychologically harmed, but also even for those who are perfectly functional. It's a way of maintaining and sustaining that good mental health through the use of ritual and practice. It goes back to the ideas of people like Alfred Adler and Gemeinschaftsgefühle as a way of being positive and engaged with nature and engaged with other people and caring and sharing and enjoying community and so forth. If that interests anyone, I can witter on about Adler and Jung and so forth to your bored to tears of hearing about it. But if you have questions about that, let me know, and I can do a separate podcast on those sorts of issues specifically. Now, how do we define deity? When we use words like gods and goddesses and deities and all those sorts of terms, what on earth do we actually mean? Again, just to confuse the hell out of everyone, there is not necessarily a clear-cut answer to that question. Is there ever? We might, or some people might, mean that a deity is a deity by its own immutable, even, nature. It is a deity in the same way that a tiger is a tiger or an elephant is an elephant. It is what it is in and of itself. That deity, and this is an argument mainly from the monotheist side, about the infinite and all-benevolent, all-encompassing nature of deity, which you don't tend to get those sorts of arguments made by polytheists who see their deities as a bit smaller scale, but would also perhaps argue for deity being eternal, same way that the monotheists were, or at least so close to eternal as makes no difference to a human being, and ineffable, one of my favourite words thanks to good omens, ineffable beyond description, something so vast that you touch on it and in that moment of awe and bliss and amazement you know it's a deity, couldn't be anything else. But trying to put that into ordinary human language defies description. It's an experience of that which is beyond words, which might be conveyed by music, by art, by a sense of wonder, but which defies the containment of language. And even things like music and art will struggle to convey the sheer vastness of that experience. So for those who take the more immutable nature path, the gods, goddesses have always existed, will always exist. They are resident and eternal in the structures of the universe. A more functionalist perspective, and I'll try not to get all sociological on you, but a more functionalist perspective might take the argument that a deity is more like a job description. That which does the job of a deity is, to all practical intents and purposes, a deity. Or at least if you take the Thomas theorem, which is an idea from sociology, that if people live as if something were true, then in terms of the consequences of their views, it may as well be true. So it's not just the Thomas theorem said, if somebody believes that they are in contact with aliens and entities from another planet, whether they are or not is irrelevant. They will live their life as if they are, and that has consequences. Their belief has real-world consequences. So getting into arguments about whether or not it's objectively true is you may as well smack your head against a brick wall. It's irrelevant. You've got to accept that there are practical consequences to the belief. The person will live as if it is true. That's the Thomas theorem. People living as if it's true. And so for some people, they will treat a being as deity. And whether or not that being actually is a deity in any objective sense of the term is besides the point, because they treat it as if it were. And so, go back to that local river example. If we went back in time 2,000 years and we found an Iron Age tribe worshipping the goddess of the local river, or worshipping the spirit of the local river as a goddess, whether or not the spirit of the river is in some big cosmological sense a goddess is besides the point, because the people of that tribe were treating it like a goddess, therefore to them it was a goddess. And you could by extension look at some of the more curious cargo cults that can be found around the world, of people, tiny tribal nations who worship, there's one that worships Prince Philip as a god. Now, to most of us, Prince Philip is most assuredly not a god. But to those people, he is, and therefore, again, Thomas' theorem, you could say they live as if he is, they behave as if he is, they treat him as if he is, and so for all practical purposes, he may as well be a god to them, because that's how they behave. And so what do we, this then begs the question, what do we expect of a deity? If we're thinking of deity in a functionalist sense, well, maybe we expect a deity to offer help and assistance. You pray to them, you ask for help with healing, or if you're a farmer, you good weather and good crop yield, or that your cattle are fertile. Maybe if you're of a more academic bent, you're in search of wisdom and knowledge of the cosmos. So when you turn to deity, you ask them for things. Do they provide those things? And so the function is that the deity is a being that listens to you and most of the time responds to you with help and with aid. There may well be a whole list of other things we could sit down and look at different cultures and say, well, in this culture they expect their gods to do X, and in that culture they expect them to do Y, and in that culture they expect them to do Z. And so we could come up with lists of sort of functions by perspective. What do people expect their deities to do? Have they communicated with a being that appears to provide that very service that they're looking for? If so, they are treating that being as a deity. The more secular end of the market might go for this notion of deity as aspiration. That if you look at a culture and you see deities, Aphrodite or Minerva or Konunos, or Brigantia, or whoever it might be, the myths, the stories, the understandings of those deities describe what people in those cultures aspired to, what they wanted, what they thought of as the highest good, the greatest power, the best, the ideal, the perfection to move towards. So the notion of deity is more a description of the highest good as it is understood by those people in that point of history, and shows you what they aspire to. And so if you have your gods, then you can understand your gods as being epitomes of that which you seek to be, which then makes it important to choose gods you really do want to be like, and not gods you really don't want to be like, because there is a kind of more of a, shall we say, a psychological aspirational function to them. We can also understand deity as a manifestation of power. Whoever or whatever seems to have enormous power over us, particularly power of life and death. And again, we're getting into functionalism a little bit there, back to that. So is one of the functions of deity to have power over life and death? Many cultures would say yes. So why do we have stories of Poseidon in ancient Greece causing earthquakes when he is displeased? So obviously an earthquake is something that has the power of life and death over often very, very large numbers of people who can die or survive an earthquake. Therefore, in a sense, any being or presence or phenomena which has tremendous power, much greater power than we do, is maybe longer lasting than we are, so that sense of eternity, that immutable quality. So that mountain will be there, has been there for 1,000,000 years and will be there for another million years. It seems eternal. Then that perhaps ascribes to it a sense of divinity. And so there's that notion that the divine should be enormously powerful and long-lasting and so forth. So we look at the phenomena around us, and anything that fits that description is perceived as being divine. These ideas are not mutually exclusive of each other. You can hold ideas that can, a combination of these ideas, and look at ancient cultures where you can see clearly a combination of these different ideas at play, as well as modern cultures with different of these ideas at play. Different ways of understanding the same things. Epistemology is a concept we introduced in the first of these lectures, which possibly you've forgotten by now, or you might be listening to them out of sequence. Epistemology is how we know what we think we know. So, I have a cup of coffee here. How do I know what it tastes like? I drink it. And then I can describe to you its bitterness and so on. I know it because I have sensory experience of it, taste, smell, etc. So that's a form of epistemology. I've come to a knowledge of what coffee tastes like. Well, how did I get that? I drank it. Now, I could, if I were teetotal, I'm not, but let's pretend I was, I could read a book written by Gilly Gordon wittering on about wine. Going, oh, this wine tastes of grapes and all of the fancy old twaddle that she comes out with. And I could sort of understand what wine tastes like without ever actually having drunk it, simply by reading descriptions given by people who have drunk it. In the same way, a virgin could kind of understand what sex feels like by reading descriptions of it, or listening to descriptions of it from other people who've had sex. But it's a form of epistemology, but a very second-hand form of epistemology, and not wholly reliable. It's not as good as having direct experience of the phenomena in question. We'll move away from coffee and sex and think about this in a more religious context. So there's different ways of understanding the truth of deities and what deities require and what they have to teach us about life, the universe and everything. Two major paths are revealed theology and tribal theology. Revealed theology can be understood through those religions that have a founding figure. Christianity is a good example, Islam is another good example, Judaism, Buddhism, in which somebody, a person, or perhaps a whole group of people over the course of time, a whole succession of people, have had visions, they've had divine revelations, or as with the case of Jesus, present themselves, state that they are themselves of divine origin, who then convey knowledge to other people. And normally at some point it gets written down, whether it's written down by the person who said it or it's written down by someone or other who heard it, it varies. But someone who comes along and says, as a founding father or a founding mother of that belief system, this is the message of the divine. Either I am divine, or last night I had a dream and an angel came to me, or I was wandering in the desert and I heard the voice of God, or whatever it may be, that there is a revealed experience, a point in time at which this event happened to that person, and they then passed it on to everyone else. And usually it gets written down, as I say, and then other people can read about God wants this, God wants that, Goddess wants this, Goddess wants that, according to those written records. There are one or two examples from the ancient world of relatively small-scale cults in which a pagan figure said, I've had a dream and this was it. That then becomes a message passed on to others. But that's quite rare in paganism. Much more common in other forms of religion, but very rare in paganism. Tribal theology is by far the most common form of pagan epistemology that you will find both in the ancient world and in the modern world, in which traditions, stories, mythologies, understandings, ritual practices, and so forth develop over the passage of time, but cannot be pinpointed to one person or one point in history. They have just built up and built up and built up. You may well have characters like Hesiod and Homer for the Greeks, and other characters, historical people elsewhere in other parts of the world, who have written down the myths, but almost without question they will say, usually in the introduction to their writings, these are the traditional stories of our people. In other words, yes, I might be one of the first people to put quill to parchment, however, I didn't invent these stories, they've been doing the round since the year dot, I'm just writing them down. So neither Hesiod nor Homer are figures of revealed theology. They were not creating those stories or having them in visions and dreams. They were simply writing down what were already old stories in their lifetimes. And so within tribal theology, there is no founding father or founding mother or revelatory figure that can be pointed to say, we know about the nature of Artemis because that person over there met Artemis in a dream or had a vision or bumped into her whilst they were wandering in the woods, and they came back and they told us all about it. Now, there might have been such a person at some point, perhaps, but they've been lost to history. And presumably there must have been people like that. So how did anyone know about Artemis? How did anyone know about Lugus? How did anyone know about Odin? Presumably at some point there were people, probably not one person, maybe lots and lots of people, who had dreams or visions or experiences, maybe kind of shamanic journeying or something like that, and they came back and they said, oh wow, I've had this experience and it blew my head off, and I met this being and they're called this and they told me that, and blah 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 blah, and it was added to and it was passed on and passed on. But in those cultures, the names of the individuals who had these experiences were not considered important. It was the story that was important rather than the person telling the story that was important. And so the name of the teller of the experience has been lost to history. Most likely it wasn't one teller of an experience, it was dozens of them over the course of time and geography. But again, their names have been lost. The stories have persisted. The rituals they suggested have persisted and been added to and embroidered and worked upon. And so people inherit practices in the ancient world and the not so ancient world, which they don't know the origins of. They don't know when people started doing this in their tribe. They've just been doing it for a hell of a long time, and there is a sense of continuity. That what defines us as a people in Boeotia or in Sparta or wherever it may be, what defines us as a people is that we continue to do the things that our ancestors have always done. They've been doing it since the year dot, therefore it's important that we continue doing these rituals on these dates, and we make these offerings and we sing these hymns and we understand that our gods, this god is like this, and that goddess is like that, and those places over there, well, that place is sacred to this goddess, and that place is sacred to that god, and all of that becomes a kind of a tribal, traditional orthopraxy that's passed on. This is what we do, even if we don't wholly know why we do it. So, give you examples. The Lupercalia ritual, which I think is great fun. I've held a number of Lupercalia rituals over the years. In its original format, in ancient Rome, was a kind of a founding day celebration for Rome itself. Recollected the story of Romulus and Remus being raised by wolves in the wolf cave. It involved two groups of young men who formed priesthoods who would gather in caves and strip off, and they'd be doing various rituals. No one quite knows the details of them. But at the end of those rituals, after various offerings have been made, they would, part of the ritual offering was the sacrifice of a goat, and they would skin the goat and cut the skin into thin leather strips. Obviously leather, skin. And then they would run around the boundaries of the city of Rome itself, around the Seven Hills, with these leather straps, and women, particularly young women who wanted to be fertile and have lots of children, would gather in big crowds and go, "Ooh, whack me," and they'd get a quick flick. Not, savage whipping, it was just a little bit of very soft goat skin, like being thwacked with a bit of old chamois leather. They'd tap these women with the bits of old leather as they were running around the city. Even in ancient Rome, there were writers saying they had no idea how this started. Why do we do this? I don't know. Do you know? I don't know. And saying it was ancient to them. They had no idea what the relevance of the goat was, what the relevance of the figs were, or the dogs were, or anything else. These were traditions, even in ancient Rome itself, that were so old even then. People had no idea why they did them, but they knew it was important that they had to do them because their ancestors had been doing it for 1,000-odd years, and they had to keep up the practice. Otherwise, something horrible might happen if they didn't do it. And it was fun, and it brought the community together, and people felt it was tremendously important. It's so important, in fact, even after Rome had converted to Christianity, for quite a chunk of time afterwards, people persisted in doing their Lupercalia rituals, to the point where various bishops were getting quite irate that the local hoi polloi wouldn't stop doing it. So there is this sort of an importance to these things, even when we've lost the starting point, the idea or the rationale behind them. We do them because that's what the ancestors do. And it's important to have continuity of identity, and not just to throw the baby out in the bathwater. Oh, that's old-fashioned. We don't want to do all this rubbish old-fashioned stuff anymore. Let's all be very new and do new things. That is not the old pagan way. The old pagan way is to maintain continuity. And so there's how do we know to do these things? Well, we know because it's tradition, as opposed to we know because this specific person told us, or we know because I have had direct experience of this. Now, it doesn't exclude the possibility of direct experience. How do you know what thought is like? Well, maybe you fall into a deep trance during ritual and you have a vision of thought. That is possible. There are quite a few people alive and walking the earth today who have direct experience of their deities, through visions and dreams and one thing and another. And that adds to the wider understanding. But you don't have to wait for one of those experiences in order to be pagan. Just as in the ancient world, most people would have described themselves as following their gods, even if they never had that direct, kind of mind-blowing personal experience of deity, because they followed them out of tradition. And so tradition and revealed theology and direct personal experience are different forms of epistemology that overlap each other in terms of how we know about gods, and not just gods, about all sorts of other beings as well. There's a quote from a much more recent source here, von Arborough, 2015. If you think that there are many gods, then you probably think that there are many ways of being a god, and there are many ways of being human, many different experiences of the world that are irreducible to each other. She goes on to say similar things about other forms of theology, if you view the world in this way, then probably it affects you in that way. And this is an element of thinking about monotheism and atheism and polytheism and all the rest of it. How do all of these different isms affect us? Some people may say, well, it makes no difference whatsoever, but others, like Yvonne Arborough, will say, actually, yes, it does make a difference. And one of the differences, although perhaps this is something as much influenced by modern day politics about human difference as necessarily about the theology itself, if you have many different deities, and they're male deities, female deities, young ones, old ones, fat ones, thin ones, all sorts of different looks to deity in terms for those cultures that portray their deity in humanized form with statues and so on. Not all cultures do that. Some of them think of deity more in the sense of animals or storms and oceans and mountains and kind of naturalistic phenomena rather than in the human terms. But that sense of there being many deities can lead to a sense of there being many truths, many ways to live your life, not only one way, that you can only be of importance and value if you tick some very specific boxes. So one of the impacts of pluralism is it's not just pluralistic about the gods, it's pluralistic about humanity as well. Accepting different types of people, different ethnicities, different states of health and ability, different sexualities, different this, different that. Understanding the world as having divinity in a lot of things. I won't go as far as to say absolutely everything, because not all theologies would go along with that. But an idea that the divine, the wondrous, can be found in many areas of life, not just in a very small number of ways of living. Something to mull over some other podcast there, perhaps. Alongside gods, there are notions of there being lots of other spirits in the world as well. I won't sit here and try and list them all because we'll die of boredom. But ancestors play a tremendous role for many forms of paganism. The notion that just because you're dead doesn't mean you're not around anymore. That there is an afterlife, and notions of afterlife vary from one type of paganism to another. But most of them have the sense that the dead are around, influencing us, sometimes for good, sometimes less so, but they are a presence, and that you can communicate with your deceased relatives, and that you yourself, when you shuffle off your own mortal coil, will become a presence which your descendants can communicate with. And so part of life is also thinking about what kind of person do I want to be when I'm dead. So do I want to be the kind of ancestor that people 100 years from now will cringe with embarrassment about, or do I want to be the kind of ancestor that they will love and turn to for wisdom and guidance and advice? Not all ancestors even, are necessarily benevolent. A lot of traditions have the idea of the unhappy or the restless or the angry dead, people whose lives were quite miserable, or possibly whose deaths were very, very unpleasant, and who remain very disturbed in death. And often there are prescriptions of rituals and things that need to be done to try and sweeten their temperament in death, because again, just because you're dead doesn't mean you are fixed in amber. A lot of cultures have the idea that you can change after death. You can become a better person once you're dead, or possibly even a worse person once you're dead. That you're not just kind of fixed in at the moment of death. You're more open to that. Animists, polytheists, etc. are open to the idea that it's not just humans that have souls, it would be said that lots of other things do. Most animists of certainly the various forms of animism I've encountered so far, have the idea that animal life and plant life are possessed of soul, spirit, of animus, whatever you want to call it, and that sometimes these can be encountered in a non-corporeal form. Now that might be as sort of ghostly ancestral presences, the soul of your dead dog or cat or whatever, or it might be in a more totemic kind of a role. There's a concept found in Siberia, and although the word itself is not found in other cultures, it can be advanced that quite a lot of cultures have the idea of spirit animals, not necessarily in the sense of dead animals, but a kind of overarching guardian spirit. So the guardian spirit of all dogs, of all horses, of all giraffes, of all polar bears or whatever, that there is a dominant protective spirit, whether you want to call it a totem or you use some other word for it. And that entity can be contacted by humans and negotiated with, and maybe offer a protective role in life, and quite often might expect something in exchange. So if you're in communication with the spirit of the wolf, that you do your part to support wolves in the wild and look after them and protect them from mostly human depredations. There's also often an idea that there are entities alongside humanity, sapient presences, that we're not the only intelligent thinking being on this planet, and that this planet isn't the only dimension of existence, that there are other dimensions and beings that move in and out of different dimensions. In some parts of the world they may be referred to as fairies, but other parts of the world there are other terms, and there's not necessarily they're just different words, the same species, the same presences, but rather that there are perhaps lots of the different presences, different species. I'm not sure that's the best word to use, but I can't think of another word offhand. Some of them may be friendly to humanity, some of them may be very hostile to humanity, some of them may be absolutely indifferent to humanity, but that we occasionally encounter each other, and those encounters can go well or they can go badly. And part of being pagan is maybe learning how to interact in an appropriate diplomatic way with beings other than humans to avoid these encounters going badly. There's also ideas of intermediary entities. Christianity has the idea, as does Islam and Judaism, so the idea of angels, not a term that many pagans are likely to use, but there's often an idea of demigods, of presences that are not quite gods, but are more than minor entities in the universe, which have a strong role to play. Some cultures talk about the handmaidens of the goddess, or the shield maidens, or the servants of this god or that god. These kind of forces, beings, entities, whatever they may be, that interact between humanity and the divine, and maybe other species in the divine as well. There's no reason to assume it's only humans, but that go betwixt and between worlds, delivering messages, delivering warnings, carrying out acts of help, maybe kicking someone's teeth in if they need a good kicking, doing all sorts of things. And again, myths, stories, rituals, so forth, to account for how best to interact with these intermediary forces. And we're back to the epistemology. How do we know these things exist? For some people it may be revealed tradition. It's a teaching within their cultural background that says these beings exist, and even if they personally have never met one, they will perhaps accept the idea that they're out there somewhere. And for other people it may be a more direct revelation that they were walking their dog in the woods one day and they saw something. They had an experience, and it's convinced them that the ancestors exist, or these other kinds of entities exist, and it's a more direct personal experience for some people. We could briefly witter about the idea of how we see different notions of deity and divinity. Are gods mirrors? It's something we, as an argument, often found within secular forms of paganism. That, for example, when sculptors in ancient Greece wanted to create a statue of Zeus, they would often invite some very prominent political dignitary to sit as a model. And it was considered a very high honour to be turned into a stone image of Zeus. So they'd find some aged politician with a big beard and who looked the part and say, well, you sit there, and then they'd go and chisel away and create an image. And likewise, if they were creating an image of Aphrodite, they'd invite one of the Hetairai, sort of a very, very wealthy, very high-class courtesan, to sit as a model for the statue of Aphrodite and chip away at the block of marble. Do the gods reflect our own aspirations, our own ideals, our own sense of who we are? So you go to a culture where just about everyone is white, and you'll find their view of the gods as just about all of the gods are white. You go to a culture where everyone is Asian, their view of the gods are all Asian. You go to a culture where everyone is a black African, and they will view their gods as being black Africans. So we see ourselves in our gods. Are the gods actually like that? Possibly. Or, going for the notion of masks, when the divine contacts a human being through a vision or a dream or some other such experience, will they put on a face that that human being can understand? We have the idea from Greek mythology that if on those occasions when people actually saw the gods in their real form, they were burnt to cinders. They just couldn't cope with what they saw and exploded into dust. Therefore, the gods need to put on a mask, on a face, on a front, to stop us from being incinerated by their overwhelming presence. But that choice of mask, that choice of outfit, if you like, is influenced by the individual person. So if your notion of deity is a six-armed woman, then when that deity wants to manifest to you, it will do so as a six-armed woman. But if a day later it was manifesting to a different person who envisioned their deity as being a giant cat, then that same presence might manifest itself as a giant cat, because the deity knows that is what you are expecting to see. You will understand that image, you will understand the symbolism, the metaphor of what that presence is trying to communicate to you. Possibly that we will understand deity through cultural lens. Different people may see the same thing in different ways, the same presence in different ways, because that presence will manifest to them in a way that they understand, rather than in the way that presence in any objective sense actually is. Maybe when it comes to deity, the notion of them having a physical body is a purely human notion. It helps us to understand something that is very, 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 very abstract, but puts it in a way that we can kind of get a handle on. And so it's best not to get too hung up about those handles, and to understand that they are, if you like, a convenient form of shorthand to communicate with mortal minds, because we wouldn't really begin to understand the true nature of such forces. They are beyond our comprehension, and so an old man with a long white beard, or a woman with six arms, or a giant cat, or a crocodile, or whatever it might be, is something we can get, something we can grasp, something we can work with. And it's much easier to communicate with a being when you can put a face to it. I know when I'm writing fiction, short stories and novels and so on, if I can have a visual image in my mind as to what the character looks like, it's much easier for me to write them. And maybe I base the visual image on an actor I've seen, or somebody I sat next to on the train once, and think, oh, I'm going to use their face, and that will be the character I'm going to write about tomorrow. And that's, rather than just a name, and it's all very abstract, if I can visualise it, that helps. And I think a lot of people maybe are like that when communicating with a very non-human presence, if we can think about it with a face, it's much easier to grasp than if we try to think about it in purely abstract, geometric, mathematical, whatever kind of terms. So it's, for some people at least, putting a face on it, a mask of the divine, is a way of making the experience more manageable, more easy to engage with. I'll try my best to keep this bit short, because I could witter for quite a while on this. But the notion of worship, the word worship comes from the Anglo-Saxon worship. Worth is where we get the word worth, value from, and ship, it's as in worship, the ship comes from sheep. But also the word shape, to shape something, comes from that same root source. And we can understand this in several different ways, which I will try and blast through very quickly. That which we worship is that which we value. So the gods reflect our values in a sense, or our values reflect our gods, depending on which way around you want to go on that one. From the Anglo-Saxon sense, worship is not about bowing and scraping and being all kind of bootlicky and oleaginous. It's simply about valuing. And so the worship of the gods, to worship the gods, is no real difference from how you would give value to another human being. Your husband, wife, children, grandmother, whoever it might be. Someone you value, you want to spend time with, you love them. You express worth to them. You worship them. Likewise, your cats, your dogs, the amount of time you spend doing hobbies, the amount of time you spend cooking and so on, all of that reflects how much you value the thing. So if you do it very little, presumably you don't value it very much, whereas if you pour your heart and soul into something and spend a lot of time on it, clearly you must value that thing. And if you don't, why the hell are you spending so much time doing it? But there is a sense in which there are a multitude, hundreds of things in our lives to which we attribute value. And we spend time and effort and energy and money and brain space and what have you on the things we value. And the gods are part of that. They are part of the beings that we value, the range of beings and forces and activities we value. And so, particularly for the polytheists, where you've got a choice of hundreds of different deities, and it's impossible to devote yourself equally to all of them because there just isn't the time. So there is a sense of, why am I drawn to this deity rather than to that deity? Well, maybe there's something about that deity that you value more about them because they're connected to an activity that's of immense importance in your life. And so the reason why you worship Aphrodite and not Hera so much isn't because you are deliberately ignoring Hera, but because the qualities associated with Aphrodite play a bigger role in your life than the qualities associated with Hera, at least at this juncture in time. Maybe 10 years down the line it'll be different, but at the moment this is what you devote yourself to. And the shape element, the shipa, is that which we value, we shape them. So somebody you spend a lot of time with, you start to have an influence on them. Or an activity you spend a lot of time doing, you get better at. Your art improves, your embroidery improves, your baking improves, because you spend a lot of time doing it, you value doing it, and you shape how you do it. But also it shapes you. You become a different person according to who you hang out with a lot. Parents who stress about their teenagers hanging out with a bad crowd. The kinds of people you value, the kinds of people you want to be amongst, shapes you as well as you shaping them. And by people, I mean not only other human beings, but animals, human animals, landscapes, trees, plants of other sorts, and of course God's spirits. So these are all, from the animist, polytheist point of view, these are all people. And who we spend time with is tremendously important. It shapes us. So it's worth paying a lot of attention to. How do you value someone you spend time with? You do nice things with them, you say nice things to them, you buy them birthday gifts or Christmas gifts or whatever. You kind of share with them. You do things with them that you hope make them happy. And you have their best interests at heart. You want good for them. And that might sometimes involve a bit of arse kicking if you think they're doing something really silly and self-destructive, and you say, oi, you stop it, because you value them. You don't want them to go downhill down the pan and hurt themselves. So you try to shield them and protect them from doing daft things. So it is both the kind of the fun stuff, but also occasionally the more stern element where you value someone so much you want to protect them from doing something daft. And it's not fundamentally much different with spirits and gods. If you value them, you make gifts, you spend time doing nice things. The things that gods consider nice might be very different from the things your cat considers nice, but you spend a lot of time with them doing stuff that you both enjoy, that brings happiness, that brings pleasure, that brings shielding, and it's a two-way street. Just as you value them, so they value you. And that should be the ideal in any kind of relationship, whether it's with a flesh and blood human or a horse, a dog. A bit difficult with a goldfish to know whether a goldfish values you, but likewise extending it up to levels of spirits and divinity, that as you value them, so they value you. In their own way, not necessarily in quite the way that you value them, but there is a reciprocity of value, an exchange and a wish to look after and help and aid and gift in both directions. And we can appreciate it's not always a harmonious relationship in the sense that your cat might want to make gifts of chewed up mice to you, and you might not be terribly appreciative of the chewed up mice, but you nonetheless understand that it is a gift, even if it's a gift you don't especially want. And we've all had, I'm sure, the experience of birthday and Christmas gifts where you look at it and you think, oh, what the hell am I going to do with this? But you understand that the person meant well by giving it. So valuing and shaping and forming, spending time with is all part of worship, whether that worship is dressing up in robes, dancing around candles and very formal kinds of religious worship, or it's of a much more informal nature, like telling stories about your favourite deities to friends down the pub is a form of worship, or shaping, spending time with, valuing with, painting a picture of your favourite deity, baking a cake, a slice of which you intend to give in offering to your preferred deity, or spirit or ancestor or whoever it might be, is an act of worship. It's not all about the candles and the prayers and the chanting, it's about lots of other things too. There is an idea of the Word made flesh, which is obviously a very deliberate play on the Christian idea. I can't remember the name of the actor there, but the guy dressed up as Jesus. And Christianity very much has this idea, obviously, of God coming down to earth and taking on the shape of Christ and walking the earth as a manifestation of the divine. Is not the only religion to believe in gods having a flesh and blood presence. So in Taoism, traditional Chinese religion, there is the idea that many of the Taoist deities were once flesh and blood humans who became deities afterwards. So Hu Chambao fell in love with an imperial inspector who was a bit of a git, frankly, and because they had this very low-class person fancy him, and he was a very high-class person, he got very, very snotty and had Hu Chambao beaten to death. When Hu Chambao arrived at the gates of the afterlife and explained to the august Jade Emperor quite how he had met his death, it was decided that he should not go to hell because he had died for love. Rather, he should go straight to the heavens and be made into a god, and so he became Tu Hashem, the god of, which literally means the little rabbit god, the god who looks after men who fall in love with other men. And that is a statue of him once he became the little rabbit god, hence the ears. A human being made divine, and not always human. So the bas relief there of Sebek, the crocodile god of ancient Egypt, and the temples of Sebek, a number of them at any rate, not necessarily all of them, but a number of them had pet crocodiles kept in sort of water enclosures. One of the more famous ones referred to by one of the Greek writers was called Petasochos, or at least that's how the Greek writer spelled it. And he talks about the idea that the Egyptians believed these crocodiles were a direct manifestation of the spirit of Sebek. So feeding one of the crocodiles, going along and chucking in a bit of meat into the enclosure and watching the crocodile eat it, was a way of making an offering to Sebek himself via his manifestation in this particular crocodile. And yes, one day that particular crocodile would die and end up mummified even. But the spirit of Sebek would then reincarnate into another crocodile and another crocodile and another crocodile. So when you were walking along the banks of the Nile, and you saw a crocodile, you could never be absolutely sure if it was just a crocodile or if this was a manifestation of Sebek himself watching you. So the gods could be anywhere, in human form, in crocodile form, in the form of a hawk, of a cat, of a hippopotamus, of any number of things made flesh and watching and walking the earth. Just as the Greeks believed that sometimes that beggar who knocks at your door and asks for a loaf of bread might actually be Zeus, disguised as a beggar, coming to test how hospitable you are, or how tight-fisted you are. And by entertaining strangers, just as the Christians said you could be entertaining angels, so the Greeks said actually you could be entertaining gods, pretending to be humans, just to see what you do or don't do. So you never quite know. And as a concept, it permeates a lot of pagan religions, the idea that the gods are not just kind of abstracted ideas floating up there in a cloud, that sometimes you might be sitting next to one on the bus and not even realise it's a divine presence, because they're not always going to have glowing lights and choirs going woo woo. They might look like a perfectly ordinary person, no different from anyone else. Or the cat that sits on your window ledge and watches you might not be an ordinary cat. It opens up a realm of weird possibilities. Ram Swarup was a devout Hindu, been dead quite a few years now, who tried to build bridges between Hinduism and Western paganism, and felt that essentially even they were different versions of the same phenomenon. That Hinduism in India and the various types of paganism in the West were kind of like the Asian version of one thing or the white European version of the other. They were different understandings of the same spiritual phenomena. And a phenomenon that had been damaged in India both by Christianity and Islam, and in the West by, chiefly Christianity, and that both the Hindu revival that he was working towards as a spiritual revival of the particular forms of Hinduism he adhered to would go hand in glove with a spiritual revival in the West of European understandings of ancestral religion, the ancient pagan religions, and that revival would lead to a great healing, great renaissance. And he did his best to try and foster that and help and communicate with Western pagans. He's not someone who's terribly well known today, which I think is a great shame. But again, it's this idea of how we understand the multitude of gods. If you're a pagan secularist, they just none of them exist, but they can be seen as different stories to explain human existence. If you're a pagan monotheist, they're all just different names for the same thing. If you're a pagan polytheist, do you envision the great world beyond as Zeus propping up a bar, having a chat with Ganesh, and down the road there's Knunos scratching his antlers? Do they talk to each other? Or do the Greeks sit in one box and the Romans in another box and the Chinese gods in another box? Do they interact in the afterlife? In some kind of spiritual plane of existence, how do you visualise these beings communicating with each other? Or, as some pagan polytheists do you think that certain deities crop up around the world, and a being known by one name in the Scandinavian countries might be known by a different name in India, and a different name in China, and a different name in the middle of Africa, and therefore that certain beings, it's not to say every god is just a different name for the same god, but there are some polytheists who believe that certain beings are known by a multitude of names and different imagery, but it's basically the same being. So Brigid, for example, Brigantia, might be known by other names in other parts of the world, or Lugus might be known by other names in other parts of the world. And so it builds bridges, as an idea at least, bridges between different cultures. And whilst very few Hindus would describe themselves as pagan, there are some who do, but very few of them. Likewise, very few Taoists, very few Shintoists, very few African traditional religionists who would use the P word to describe themselves. But there's a lot of overlap and similarity and common ideas that crop up in different parts of the world. And if we're thinking in terms of maybe all of these religions getting a very short shrift from the more aggressive forms of monotheism, perhaps we've got a lot in common with each other, and there's a lot of bridges to be built. Certainly an argument that Ramsvaart made, that there's a lot of bridges to be built between different cultures around the world, because not only do they have certain similar ideas, but they're also going to be treated in quite the same way by the more dominant religions of the world, in terms of, by dominant I mean politically dominant, as well as its sheer scale of adherence. Something to mull over. The final one, which I'll try and get put up on time next week, will look at issues of theodicy, how pagans understand notions of suffering, why suffering happens, what's the point of it, and wickedness, why are some people just so bloody awful, how do we understand that, and different ideas on pagan ethics. As previously, if you've got any questions, you can either email them to me or type them as messages under the uploads, and I'll try and address those next week if I see the messages in time. Thank you for listening.